All right, so welcome back, everyone. Our second panel features three practitioners, knowledge holders, community members, heritage workers. It's hard to define who they are because they wear so many different hats, but we're really excited to have them here today to share their experiences and some of their thoughts with regards to some questions that we've posed to them in advance. And so I'd like to quickly introduce these panelists to you all today. So the first panelist that we have is Sabra Kauka. Sabra has worked for 20 years as a freelance photojournalist working for publications such as Time, Life, and the National Geographic. She is a kumu of Hawaiian Studies at the Island School on Kauaʻi, a kumuhula for Napua o Kamaile, and Kauaʻi's coordinator for the Department of Education's Hawaiian Studies Kupuna program, a kumu kapa on Kauaʻi, who has taught many hundreds of students, as well as a team member of the Kulia Ikanu'u project at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. She is a founding member and past president of the Napali Coast Ohana, a grassroots nonprofit foundation dedicated to the preservation of the natural and cultural resources of the Napali Coast State Park on Kauaʻi. Currently, Sabra serves on the Garden Island Resource Conservation and Development Board and has worked tirelessly for years to restore and preserve culturally significant sites. Our second panelist is Puakea Nogelmeier, who is a professor of Hawaiian language at the University of Hawaii at Manoa, where he has taught for more than 30 years. His bachelor's degree in Hawaiian language, and he has a bachelor's degree in anthropology and Hawaiian language, a master's in Pacific Island Studies, as well as a PhD in anthropology, which he completed at UH Manoa. Beyond the university, Puakea has trained for decades in learning Hawaiian language, traditional dance, chant, and literature. He has undergone formal training and ceremonial graduation, known as an uniki, as both a dancer, known as an olapa, and a teacher of dance, a kumuhula. A prolific composer of Hawaiian poetry in both traditional and modern styles, his compositions are widely published and recorded. Nogelmeier works extensively with the various Hawaiian language archives and is active in rearticulating historical Hawaiian knowledge into fields of study today, producing translations, new presentations, and reprintings of archival materials for publication and dissemination. And our last panelist is Keao Nesmith. Dr. Keao Nesmith was born and raised on Hawaiʻi Island in Hawaii and is engaged in research on and restoration of cultural sites on his home island, as well as other places around Hawaii. He dabbles in archaeology as a hobby and participates in a variety of activities in his culture. He has also translated and authored several books. Among his translations are Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventure in Wonderland, J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit, J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, and L. Frank Baum's The Wonderful Wizard of Oz from the original English into Hawaiian. He has also translated Antoine de Saint-Exupéry's Le Petit Prince, translated into The Little Prince, from the original French into Hawaiian, as well as a Hawaii Pidgin translation. With a PhD in applied linguistics from the University of Waikato in New Zealand, Keao has taught Hawaiian language at various universities across the Pacific in Hawaii, Tahiti, New Zealand, and in Paris, France, and he currently teaches Tahitian language at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Aloha mai kako, and thank you for joining us today. So the way that we are going to do this conversation is that as I mentioned, we've sent questions in advance. We've talked about these questions together. And really, it's just an opportunity to have an important conversation around the things that need to happen in our institutions to do the kind of work that we want to do. But before we get into that, I'd like our panelists to each to briefly tell us a little bit about themselves and how they ended up in their current career path or cultural practice. And so I'd like to start with Sabra, then we go to Puakea, and then to Keao.
Maikai. Can you hear me now, Helena?
Maikai.
Mahalo nui kako, aloha. I'm so honored to be here with all of you this afternoon. And it's really a pleasure to listen to your presentations, your stories. I've not participated in this well, gathering, the symposium in the past, and it's so interesting to me because I have to acknowledge my aunt, who was Eleanor Lilihana A.E. Horswell Williamson, and she worked at Bishop Museum for many years with Tutu, Mary Kavena Pukui. And as a child, I would go to visit her in the museum or wait, go there and wait for my mom or dad or someone. And I would walk through the corridors. And in those days, there were many artifacts that were out on shelves along in the hallway. And as I'm going through, I'm just looking at all of this, and my brother's telling me, keep going, don't you touch anything, keep your hands off. But every once in a while, I just couldn't help but stop and just be amazed by what I saw in the hallway. Now I think all of that is in, archival conditions. But it is with great appreciation that, I admire the work that you all do. It is so important, so very important. And I have been so thankful to have been able to see so many of the artifacts of our past, and um, even being invited to the Smithsonian for the Smithsonian Folklife Festival several years ago. They did a program on weavers of Hawaii, and they wanted me to work with them to coordinate and to help them choose weavers here. And oh my gosh, I said, oh no, I will simply gather everyone together. We'll have a symposium, we'll have a conference, workshop, and you can see for yourself, and you all can make the decision. I'll just gather everyone. But it was a wonderful, wonderful gathering and a wonderful chance for us to visit Washington, D.C. and the Smithsonian, and to see the incredible collection of Hawaiian artifacts that are there, which I had no idea. I had no idea they were there. And to thank our kings and queens, Kapiolani, all of them who said, you know what? I think you need to have some of our treasures in your collections. And also, I must also thank Bishop Museum, because in the past year and a half, 2 years, they've held several symposiums again, one based on kapa, another one based on ulana lauhala, on weaving. And in seeing those, we have been able to go into the archives and to see all these works of great beauty. And they're just very moving to me to see the work of our kupuna so beautifully preserved and so amazing. The quality of work is just amazing to me. And also, just here in this little island of Kauaʻi, I've been to Grove Farm Homestead Museum. They have been very, very open and very generous in allowing us to view the collection of kapa and kapa tools and all of those. That really is the main reason that I've gone to see their collection. But it's such a prize to be able to actually see these up close and to touch them and to feel them and to admire their beauty and the workmanship that's in them. It's just fabulous. And also on one trip to Aotearoa, we were able to visit Te Papa Museum. And again, and this was before the Cape came home. And when we went in to see it, the curator asked us, are you here to take it home? And I said, no, not us. No, but I support that and I thank you. And, we'll get the big wigs to do that, all the heavy hitters in there. And yes, thank you, they have done that. But I'm learning so much from all of you. And I say aloha to all my friends. I am going to follow up on the question of, is anyone on Kauaʻi recording what's happening now on our island and the impact that it's having? I have friends who are tremendous writers. I will ask them, is anyone doing oral histories now? Because this is quite a time of great change. And I so appreciate being able to hear and listen and learn from all of you via this method. So thank you, Helena. Thank you, all of you.
Mahalo. Puakea?
Let me just, I guess, there's too many stories to connect to, but my relation to museums has been long and positive, is what I would say. But I've been able to see a great change in the role museums are sort of holding in our society. I was introduced to the Bishop Museum. It was probably the first real museum that I had walked into. As a 25-year-old Lopi guy from Waianae in shorts and t-shirt, I can't remember if I even was wearing slippers. And at the time, if you didn't have a PhD and a letter of introduction, you couldn't get into their materials. It was made very clear. But I'd been sent there by Mr. Kelsey. And so that was my port of entry. And I was allowed to review some of the tapes that he had put on wax cylinders. But at the time, this is how very different it was, I was seated next to the receptionist so that she could make sure that I listened to the tapes and took no notes, because knowledge was money and we don't give it away. And so I could, bring back a report to Mr. Kelsey, but I couldn't bring back any information. Now, luckily for me, and the interaction there, because it went on for a couple of months, was very positive. I mean, that's where I met Kenneth Emery. He was engaging. He wanted to foster any kind of interaction. But the receptionist was a lady named Pat Bacon, who that set up a wonderful relationship that, has been decades long. So that was sort of my port of entry. I've been able to interact with almost every collection on Oʻahu. And I've always found if they're not generative, they're receptive. And so I think that's an important piece of the idea of collaboration, is oftentimes there's not the luxury of generating interaction, but a receptiveness to it. So I'm not sure what else I could cover in this piece of our panel. Is there any particular topic you wanted to touch on?
Well, just in general, because you've had such a long relationship with institutions, perhaps if you'd like to talk about some recent projects that you've done.
What I would say is all of my recent projects are actually continuing projects from ages back. I became passionate about language, and there was actually a single event that sort of made that happen. We were learning chanting from Edith Kanakaʻole and Edith McKinsey. Our pay for that training was public presentation to show the general population that chant still existed. I performed a chant. An elderly gentleman came up and spoke to me in Hawaiian. I was dumbfounded and said, "I'm sorry, uncle, I don't speak Hawaiian." He said, "But how can you understand what you're chanting?" I said, "Well, I memorized the English," which sounded a little shallow. And then he said, "But how can you tell how well you did?" And I don't even know what I answered. It was, some blah, 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 blah. And he said, "You did real well, boy." And that's really, he'd only come up to congratulate me. But I left that thinking, how can I engage here without knowing? And I started to learn language, and that's how I met Mr. Kelsey, and ended up just investing anywhere that I could find it. Became rather passionate about it. So those projects opened up that Hawaii has a repository of Hawaiian language material that is second to none. It's really incredible for such a little island chain, produced more written material than the rest of the Pacific combined. And it had lain dormant. So most of my projects are with opening that repository and reconnecting it, because opening it isn't enough. And so trying to reconnect that, and that's how most of my projects come forward. I've retired from the university, taught language for 35 years. But the university, sort of in the conflict with revitalization of language, actually sort of demonized translation from Hawaiian. And I have to say, I really laud Keao for the effort to move Hawaiian, and I'm loving your translations. And the fact that you're doing them is, I think, service to generations. But we're doing the sort of the backward is the repository laid there while revitalization opened up. And much of revitalization was unaware of both language, idiom, historical context, a lot of things that students who were with a master's degree could pick up something from the newspapers or from one of the archives and not understand it because the context was lost. So that's what we set up a nonprofit where I actually familiarize translators with the historical context, language of the past. So that's been our focus is, historical language. It's still my passion. We have 14 in training right now. It feels really good to be doing what we're doing. A lot of what we're creating today might not even be utilized and fully articulated for another generation. It's okay. If we don't do it now, how long would it wait? So that's sort of where we are today is training translators to be completely comfortable with diving through that. There's 150 years of written Hawaiian language that's an awesome resource. So how can we make them familiar with it enough that they become resource people? Create resources in the process, but create some resource people. So that's mostly what I'm engaged with today.
Mahalo nui loa. Keao, for this question, for your response, Sabra and Puakea has done this wonderfully. You can also, if you could talk a little bit about your experiences of working with museums or the heritage or archaeological sector as part of your introduction into how you ended up in your current career path.
Alo nui, alo no kako apa ko ino a Keao Nesmith. My name is Keao no ke kaha Kauaʻi no wau. I was born and raised ke kaha Kauaʻi, and I thinking the whole span of how I got to where I'm at right now in my career and such, you might say, I would definitely say I got into it kicking and screaming, trying to avoid it as much as possible. I did not get into the career I had ended up in at the university willingly. I got dragged into it, but growing up, I was born in Kekaha, born in Waimea, raised in Kekaha. Among my neighbors on my street, who were either Ni'ihau people, but when I was a kid, there were still lots of elderly people who were not Ni'ihau people, but from Kekaha and Hawaiian speakers. They were already kind of in their 60s and up when I was growing up, right across the street from my house. For example, Taluags, and further down the road, Nakaihiki, Samfong family, Auntie Margaret Aipolani, all these people who are not Ni'ihau, but are Hawaiian speakers, were Hawaiian speakers because they're all gone now. And so all the ones who are left are people from Ni'ihau. Growing up in our family, so I was surrounded. It was always around. My own family were not speakers of Hawaiian, but my playmates were because they're all from Ni'ihau, and we used to just hang out pretty much almost every day. In the summers, my family would come to Oʻahu, where I am living right now in Honolulu. And by the way, as a warning, I apologize in advance. I live in Makiki, and the fire station is right next door. And at any given moment, someone will have a tragedy. So, kalamai. And every summer growing up, we would come and spend at least a month here on Oʻahu at my family's compound in Kahana Valley. And growing up, it was rather an extension of my experience in Kekaha. In our home, the De La Serna family, we had other Hawaiian speakers living with us. We had my tutu Alice Namakelua, who lived with us. We had tutu man Peter Kau, who also lived with us. We had Grandma Lydia de la Serna, who also lived with us, and Papa George, all Hawaiian speakers. We had Auntie Hetty Ao, who lived down the road. And Puakea, he was already gone when I came into the scene, but he left a lasting impression over there. But this was my experience, and these are the people I wanted to cling to, and my own grandma, my mom's mom, and Ika Ohane. And there were conversations among all these people about the university and about academia. And it was often with a wrinkle in the brow kind of a thing, like side eye, what's going on? Or what are those crazy people doing over there? And, you know, scratching their head at what those guys were doing over at the institution. Also growing up, my parents decided after having 7 kids that they wanted to do a bachelor's degree because they didn't have one. And they started taking night courses at Kauaʻi Community College. It was a program through West Oʻahu College. And I was still elementary school, 3rd grade maybe. And by the time I hit high school, I think freshman year or sophomore year is when they graduated, because they only did night courses all those years. They joined the archaeology club, and Dr. Pila Kikuchi was the archaeologist and professor and the head of the archaeology club. And almost every Saturday on Kauaʻi, my folks would drag us kids in our chakalaka truck and go around the island with the archaeology club to all these different locations, and up Mauka, down Mākai. Very interesting. We always enjoyed it. Always as kids enjoyed it. And we really ate it up. We would do the excavations. We found many fish hooks. We found many stone things that were created. We didn't even know. I mean, as a kid, we were like, wow, I found something. I even found the jawbone of a person that I didn't know was a jawbone of a person at the time when I picked it up and started running around as a kid. Hey, look at me, I'm an archaeologist. Come to find out, it got snatched away from me by Dr. Kikuchi, and we had to go and reinter that. But that was a moment that triggered a huge lasting impression that stays with me today. Because of that experience, I naturally gravitate to these kinds of activities. And my biggest aloha is to Auntie Sabra, of course, for introducing me to Napali side. And I guess we'll talk more about that when the time comes. But as introduction, I guess that's good. By now, I have lots of family in Hilo, so I started my bachelor's program at BYU Laie. I was at first out of high school. I was living with my grandma in Hauʻula. Even there at the time, there were quite a few elderly Hawaiian speakers living in the Hauʻula Laie Kauku area that I would hang out with almost daily. Of course, in my grandma's home, we only spoke Hawaiian. And that's my introduction to Olelo Hawaii, was from all of this childhood and growing into it. Not once did I ever step foot in a classroom to learn Olelo Hawaii. So the way I perceive how the institution uses Olelo to me is quite different, because I always reflect back to my own experience. But yeah, so coming to, that's why I said earlier, I got into the career teaching at the university, at the institution, kicking and screaming, because I resisted. I really didn't want to. But here we are. Mahalo nui.
Mahalo. A really quick anecdote. As we were preparing for this, Keao sent me an email. Wait, are you related to this person? So the sister I was talking about in my presentation, that was one of his students when he was a kumu at Navahio Kalaniʻo Pu'u. So it's such a small world here in Hawaii. So mahalo for that. The next question that I'd like to pose, and again, we'll stick with the same order, so Sabra, Puakea, and Keao. But the next question shifts our focus to, from your perspective, why must museums and related institutions, so this can be historic sites, cemeteries, places that essentially create a certain kind of history or care for our particular place. We're thinking broadly here. why must these institutions work with communities as they plan programs, exhibitions, or in general, the kind of work that they want to do?
Because the culture is alive. The culture continues to live. And in order for it to live, we have to share the knowledge of it. We have to share the stories of it. We have to share the arts of it. It lives.
Mahalo, Sabra.
Well, I think it gives so much opportunity for residents and for, for the input. But, the interaction with the community is almost a two-way education, because the folks that are living culture are the resource to make things, brighter, clearer, better. But the keepers of artifacts and the shepherds for some of these sites, they have their own protocols and science as well. And to make the folks out in the field more aware of that, I think that interchange is invaluable. Because, part of the reason that a doer, and I'm not fond of the term practitioner, because most of the doers are done practicing, they're just doing it. But they're not necessarily long-term shepherds. Some of these collections have actually been kept safe for a couple of 100 years, through a set of protocols that have become a science in a way. So it takes a certain level of training to do that. And having the community, the practitioners, be familiar with what some of those restrictions, some of those foundations are, that's what allows the conversation to really become productive, probably. So I think that interchange can be a two-way piece. We certainly can learn. I do want a thing about reaching out to the community, get your stuff and come in and do your job. Kauaʻi was a great mentor for me in language. And we were doing a radio show trying to provide public language. And he would introduce me to native speakers that, to try and cajole them to be guests on. Nobody wanted to be a guest on a radio show, come on. But we had gone down into Puna and we met with the Kauaʻi family, with delightful resource people, weavers, language resources extraordinaire. And when he brought up the subject, they said, no, we're over it. We're over it. The university keeps coming. They film us for an hour and they think they got us. Some student comes and, we answer their question. They think they got it. We never find out if they got their degree or their grant or their program or that. It was so extractive. And you don't have to be an outsider to be extractive. You can be just from a different zone. So that notion of interaction being mutually beneficial has to sort of frame, I think, the interplay with the community. That's probably enough said.
Mahalo, and thank you for bringing up that point with regards to the language of cultural practitioner. I know this is something we talked about in it previously, so if Keao, you'd like to comment on that as well. And I'd like to preface by saying that when we generated these questions, these are the kinds of terms that are frequented or are terms that museum professionals are trained to use, but that training might not necessarily translate into the ways we use it in community or outside of the institution. So this is a really important conversation with regards to institutions and the kinds of language and the ways we talk about our collaborators, the doers, and those that we reach out to for our project. So Keao.
Yeah, mahalo for that last note there. Yeah, my view on the practitioner thing is very pedestrian, because it's like, it's giving a label to something that is so commonplace. You don't switch on and off. I'm not a person and then switch on normal Hawaiian practitioner. That's kind of the point, the sticky point for me, because every time we frequent Starbucks, we are suddenly a practitioner of American culture. Nobody ever says that. Nobody ever says practitioner of American culture because we have Thanksgiving. You know, it's never said, but when we're talking about Hawaiian, suddenly that's what we're saying. That's kind of the buzzword. So, but it's great for grant writing. So, you know, it's the kind of thing you write grants for. And, you know, but you would never write a grant for American practitioners of culture. So it's, to me, it's just bizarre. It's just what I do, you know. I'm never turned on and turned off. I'm always on. So, and my example earlier was lawyers practice law, doctors practice medicine. I don't practice Hawaiian. You know, it sounds like being Hawaiian is a job. But no, going back to Auntie Sabra's point earlier, she's talking about how language changes, our culture changes. I was wondering if I could share screen. I have an image I wanted to show. Okay,
Absolutely.
so yeah, here. So this is an image I wanted to share. So this is what Auntie Sabra introduced me to. This is Nu'alolo Kai Kauaʻi. And it didn't look like this. I mean, it kind of did, but with Auntie Sabra and the Hui, Napalikos Ohana, we go into there, and it used to be only puweeds, and then it developed into restore. So there are, of course, certain practical reasons why we can't restore exactly to perfect, beautiful condition, but I want to show you guys something. You see the mo'o? Look like Kermit the Frog. This is what you call the academic term is in situ. This is in place. It's not on a shelf in a museum. And it's a mystery because it also seems cut. It also seems cut and dressed. It's not one rock, it's two rocks, and they're placed upon each other. And that's where you stand and scratch your head. But you have to be there in order to see it in context. So all the items that you might find displayed in a museum on a shelf, this is where it came from. This is the medium in which those items derive. This is where I belong. This is where I feel most comfortable. And we have been fortunate many times here by working here at Nu'alolo to actually stumble across those items that are now labeled on the shelves in the museum. And of course, we, in our protocol, we keep them. You know, we don't take them home. We keep them where they are. We just make sure they're put in place properly, and we cross our fingers, make plenty pule that nobody will come across and walk away with it. But we also feel confident that we've put them back, and we also say pule. So we're doing the work. We also say pule. We say mahalo anui loa. To all of Kupuna who are there, have been there, will be there. And one day in the future, it'll be us to come back and be kia'i of this kind of place. So this is the medium in which I thrive. And I'm fortunate to have very close buddies from Kauaʻi, from the other islands, who are, of this younger generation who are extremely passionate about this kind of work. And so that's something I wanted to share real fast. So if you're talking about my integration with museum, well, the museum is where something ends up and gets kept and preserved. And there are good reasons why museums exist. I mean, they're a controlled environment in which things that otherwise would fall to decay can get preserved for how many ever years into the future. This right here is before the museum came around. And this is the raw environment in which those items that end up in the museum derive from. And so it's absolutely amazing, and Auntie Sabra can attest to, whenever we come across an item, it gets us really charged and really excited, and it keeps us here. It keeps us going. I'll stop there.
So Sabra, if you'd like to respond or perhaps say a little more.
Oh, I'm very moved by the photographs that Keao has shared with you, because it is a very, very special place to us. And, I see that Noel Kahanu is on this Zoom. Aloha to you, because the work that Hui Malama did 25, 30 years ago now set the stage for us to begin to go into Malama Nu'alolokai because it began just a few days before Hurricane Iniki in 1992, was late August, early September, and Hale Aloha Ayao had asked us to come in and return some iwi kupuna to their place of origin. And so that is what brought us back there. You know, as you all on this recall, it was NAGPRA, yeah, Native American Graves Repatriation and Protection Act, that he worked on so diligently there in Washington, D.C. with Senator Inouye, that required that all of these things be returned to their place of origin. And we were so honored here on Kauaʻi to be a part of this, returning our kupuna to Nualolokai. That was my first trip in there. I acknowledge the Ohana, particularly the family of Uncle Patty Malama, for being there and for supporting this, because they are direct descendants of it. I can't tell you how meaningful it is for us to go in. We access during the summer months when it's possible. This year has been quite hammer-jam because of COVID, but we were able to get the first team with Keao and all of those people who go in and do major weed whacking. And, you know, unfortunately, there's a herd of goats that live there. We are trying very hard I want them completely gone. Anyway, their numbers are reduced, but they're not completely gone. We have to keep, you know, supporting the hunters, and please go in and take the meat home, you know. But at this stage in my life, it's very important for me to train the next generation. Actually, Keao's next generation is next generation down. Those Opio who are in middle and high school now, to know these places and to know the protocol and to carry on in taking care of all these beautiful, beautiful sites that we have here in Hawaii.
Mahalo, Sabra. I just wanted to comment real quickly that I think you folks are bringing up a really important point with regards to, you know, within the academy, because that's where a lot of us operate. There's this tendency to think about archaeology or museums as simply colonial institutions. But I think what you folks are bringing up is the ways in which we can use the tools from these various disciplines to do the kind of work that we want to do in our communities. For example, you know, when Keao was talking, it made me think about how important an archaeological sensibility, or essentially being able to look at a landscape and to appreciate the value and the things that are left there, is something that it's a skill that is trained. It's a practice, right? It's something that is translatable across disciplines, even in museums. And it's something that I think within our institutions is something that we can learn from, this idea of connecting to place, recognizing that our collections and our objects are not just tied to communities of people, but they're tied to these places. And if you haven't gone to those places, then you're not getting the full scope or able to appreciate the value of these particular collections to the communities that are so invested in them. So mahalo very much for bringing up those points. What I'd like to do now is we'll move on to another question. And the next question is, how can those who work in museums and like-minded institutions be better allies or supporters of the doers, of the collaborators, of those who are living culture through their own work? And so we can start with Puakea.
Well, I think engaging is really important. What we were just talking about what belongs in a museum has changed over time. And I don't think that archaeology or museum science or anything is inherently colonial. It can be indigenized. It's a science, it's a technology, it's a set of principles it can actually be guided from an indigenous mindset or from a, call it grounded mindset. And so engaging at that level with folks that would be providing guidance. I point out the volcano at one point had a huge discussion on what to do regarding Niagara and their collection of artifacts that had come up. And so they put together a Kupuna advisory board to talk about all kinds of different issues dealing with the park. And Kauaʻi was a member of the board. I was on the board with him, but as his sort of associate, more or less. But a bunch of their artifacts, they had a list of artifacts. What shall we do? Most of these were found literally underground. And so long discussion with Kauaʻi. He was raised by his great-grandfather, and on their property at Okoi was a burial cave that the great-grandfather was responsible for. And a number of times when Kauaʻi was a young boy, they had to open the cave because there had been either serious rain or it was the season to remove the dead. And what he had explained was within that burial cave were burial items. And there were other items that weren't necessarily burial items. They were for safekeeping. And that's what he brought to the discussion at the volcano. He said, some of these are directly burial items and they should be restored and they should be put back in place. They really weren't meant to be in the hands of anybody after the person they were buried with. Some of these pieces should find homes where they are safe, because that's why they were stashed, for safety. So that kind of guidance, I think, was really useful with their administrative level. So if they had not engaged in dialogue, none of the leaders of the pack, I think, were actually very culturally competent at the time. But they certainly recognized that they wanted to attend, to work it. And so they created a network that could at least be part of that deciding body. And so that was really worthwhile, I think. It was a good example of engagement.
This is a shameless plug. So in our first webinar, we had Keola Awang, who worked at Havo at the National Park and was instrumental in forming that Kupuna advisory panel. So if you didn't attend the first webinar, you can see the recording where she talks a little bit about kind of the other side with regards to being a Hawaiian, helping to form this advisory group within the national park system. So thank you so much for bringing that up.
Well, it was really worthwhile. And what it did is it challenged, actually, the doers. I mean, Kauaʻi is just a doer, right? Challenged him to be looking at this in light of what a collection or a shepherd institution needs to be doing. And so, it was a learning experience for him, but he was able to shed, a great deal of light on the topic, I think. So I didn't know who generated the Kupuna Council there. I assumed it was more good wording for a grant request than anything, but it actually was very effective.
Wonderful, mahalo. We'll go to Keao.
The question brought to mind something Puakea said earlier about access. And so how can the institution, the gatekeepers at the museums, for example, assist those of us who are thriving outside in the dirt and in the lo'i and in the caves and whatnot, not because we work for it or are even interested in museum archiving work, but Puakea talked about access. And so my message would be allow access, facilitate access. Don't make it difficult for us, because Puakea was exactly right. There was a day where when you were a member of the community, you wanted to access stuff that wasn't on the display behind the glass case. You have to start with the assumption the answer is going to be no. And for all these decades, you have to assume the answer is just going to be no. And they will throw all kinds of excuses why no, or just not say anything. It has been the case where you are met with silence, a wall of silence. that would, you know, that's how cheese, because like you said earlier, knowledge is money, yeah? So no, we will not allow you access. Brah, that used to belong to my community. You know what I'm saying? You don't deny me access to what used to belong to my own community. So for locals, we get angry, you know. It makes us angry to be denied access. But facilitating access, and I mention it this way because I've already seen in the past number of years the shift, the swing to allowing facilitation. And I'm very happy that there has been this swing. It really is different than what it used to be. Um, and it's been great to be welcome in the back doors of Bishop Museum and other museums, to be allowed what otherwise we would have thought, we would have assumed, because these days, even still, I go like, score, I can't believe they opened this door for me, because I feel so lucky. But inside me, I'm like, I shouldn't be thinking of myself lucky. This should be a given, that I should be allowed this kind of access. I shouldn't think of myself lucky. You know what I mean? So if those can, who are in the institution, can shift that thinking into thinking, this is the property of not the museum, the community. That is our culture. That, who knows whose kupuna that, you know, who that kupuna is. But you know, so facilitate and participate. So earlier when I was saying, my purpose in wanting to show the images that I showed before is, come here. This is where your items came from. Let me show you this aina. This is
Yes.
the context, and this is the context your items are coming from, and that, so where our context represents the beginning, your museum represents the end. Keep in mind that the journey between the beginning and the end is most times, if not all the time, fraught with distress, and many ohana are pained that they had lost items. Malama Ohana, for example, Uncle Patty Boy, Malama, who recently passed away, his family is from Nu'alolokai. But when we discover stuff, that wasn't in his generation. He's like, he's just as surprised as the rest of us. So when he sees these things, he's like, oh, but well, obviously my ohana was from over here, so it's not a kind, but he doesn't necessarily feel that direct connection to the poi pounder we just found, wherever we found it over there, which we have, because that was before his time. But still, he knows my ohana is from here, so he has a certain right to say, okay, and he has been approached by museum curators and stuff in the past about what to do with certain items that were found. And so he kind of, oh, okay. And in speaking to him myself about those incidents, he was like, oh, that wasn't when I was here. So that was before my time. So he's like, oh, okay, you guys take it. So here's a local kupuna alive today, making a decision about final disposal of an item that existed generations before him, but he knows it's his ohana. So he's like betwixt and between himself. And then when word gets out and the rest of the community hears that there was this event where archivists came and found these items in Nu'uaʻalolo, ended up taking over to Bishop Museum, everybody else was more pissed than Uncle Patty Boy. You know, or like, mina, you know, it's like we have this, like, you know, but at the same time, there are proper arguments and rationale for those items being in the museum, because for proper care. However, proper care for us, we get the pali over there. You see all those pukas over there up inside. That was considered proper care, you know, up in the pali, all those caves and all that was considered proper care. So, you know, there is a massive swing happening in what is considered normal protocol, proper protocol, in the final disposal of items that are found like that. So Mahalo.
Mahalo. I just want to make a really quick connection. So you brought up the care of placing these precious objects or belongings into caves and safekeeping them. This is an example of that kind of deep culture that Helen was referring to earlier in this webinar, in the sense that there are these practices that may not necessarily be the things that people typically think of, but they're a part of the culture in itself, and they're as important to understand and to create spaces in which we can rediscover or relearn or know about these. So mahalo for that. Sabra, do you have anything to add to this question?
Oh boy, yeah, a lot of thoughts coming through here. And you know, we once Pila Kikuchi, Moses Keale, Dr. Emery, all of them in the 50s, I believe it was, went into Nualolokai to preserve the artifacts that were coming out of the cliff, or you know, and I actually I thank them for that. I thank them for securing these things of beauty, because at that time I believe there was a very hot market, a black market, if what you say, what you would call it, for artifacts of from not just from Hawaii, but from all over, and to be held in private collections. So on the personal side, I appreciate that these things were preserved, that we are able to see them today, but bringing it into today, part of our thinking is that the museums have enough now. If these things fell out of the cave, up in the cliff, for instance, the birds may have kicked them out, then we will find a way to return them. And that makes me a little nervous, because those caves are really high, and I don't have the rope ladders in place, and you know, and the scaffolding and all of that. And we would need to, if we're going to do that, we need to do it somewhat under cover of darkness, so that the whole coast and everybody on it couldn't see what we were doing, where we were doing it. There's a lot that we need to talk about. We're going to do that kind of thing. But I also want to, this is an open invitation to all of you to come in and see these kinds of places that you have a responsibility to care for as well. I see Kamalu on this, Kamalu. I see Angela Neller, and I believe Angela's in Washington. I see Frank Hay, who's from Kauaʻi. Frank, have you ever been in there? You gotta go, man. And of course, Helen, and you, Helena. Let's make time and do it.
Absolutely. And I do want to just clarify something that Auntie Sabra is telling us. It's an invitation, but it doesn't mean just show up without asking someone, can I come first? Or, you know, making those connections first. We don't want to just show up somewhere and be like, oh, I came to see this. Well, I didn't know you were going to be here. So it's, again, this is returning to this issue of cultural competency, is that, you know, if you have this invitation, treat that invitation with respect as well. Make sure that you communicate with those from those communities when you want to go and visit these special places, to learn the stories in a way that is done in a manner that is mutually beneficial, that is done with consent, and not something that is just because you wanted to come at the end of the day.
Paleke Flores is also on this. Paleke was in high school. Keao was, I believe, his teacher, who, when they first came in, Keao, how many years ago was that? 20? 15, 20?
16 now.
Oh, okay, only 16 years. All right, fine. So both of these young men.
Oh, for him, 16 for him.
Okay, both of these young men, contact them. Let them know you want to come.
Mahalo. Okay, this is such a wonderful conversation. We're going to move on to the next question. And this is another question where we talked previously about some issues around language. And I'm presenting the question as is. because it's a part of the process that we're trying to get at here, is that there seems to be, at least from this conversation that I'm getting, a degree of, I'm not quite sure what the right word would be, but essentially the language that we learn by reading the literature. I'm talking about museum professionals. The language that we learn from the literature, or what we read about, may not necessarily be the right language when you're actually engaging with living communities and trying to make these kinds of connections. And so I make this preface because the question is, how can museums present more authentic and respectful representations of Hawaii's communities and Hawaiian culture to visitors? And the issue, or at least the point of conversation, was with regards to this question of authentic and authenticity. So I just wanted to bring that up because it's important for us to in some ways, reveal these kinds of conversations that we've had, that we may have came up with the questions, but that doesn't necessarily make them perfect. And by having the conversation, we get to learn, okay, maybe next time we need to be a little bit more careful with the wording that we're using, or to really just think beyond what we're prescribed to think or what we learn to think in a book, particularly when it comes to training for museum professionals. So I'll repeat the question one more time, and then we'll have Puakea start. So how can museums present more authentic and respectful representations of Hawaii's communities and Hawaiian culture to visitors?
And we'd start by deconstructing authentic, and then we'd deconstruct visitors. So it's the notion of authentic. I mean, to familiarize yourself with what are the sort of, I guess, the porous boundaries, or maybe it's the contextual boundaries of authenticity, as the kind of language that's being used has to connect to whether your visitors are, local inquiry or tourists. You have to be able to get, communication going. So what's going to make sense is like the word cultural practitioner. If you're talking to people that makes sense to, you have to acknowledge that it's there and then find the understanding middle ground. Authentic language, Hawaiian language. Now there's context, every native speaker isn't homogenous. There's regions, there's their own personal experience, there's background, and that's today. And now move that back 200 years. I'm going to apologize and step away and let someone else talk.
Keao.
Yeah, and I wanted to tip of the hat to Puakea too, because if I can, I'm going to jump back to my share screen and my mo'o. Anybody who's read Puakea's work on Hi'iaka Kapolio Pele and comes to Nu'alolokai and sees this, if you're paying attention, you're going to immediately think Kilioi Kapua. Kilioi Kapua was that mo'o who dominates the pali, all the pali of Napali, and is the one who took possession of Lohi'au's body when he died. And Hi'iaka had to come and find Kilioi to find Lohi'au's body. And she had to fight, Hi'iaka had to fight Kilioi for his body, which she eventually kicked Kilioi's okole in order to secure the body of Lohi'au in order to fulfill the rest of her destiny. So if you're thinking along those lines, it's the mo'olelo that made you think this could be a representation of Kilioi Kapua. I also wanted to point out, if you look over here, what's so interesting to me is you see the big rock on top of the wall over there. That we can't move that. It's there. But if you look at it, this is looking at it from an angle. If you look at this wall straight on, the po'o, the head over here is over to the right. Then the wall represents the rest of the body of the mo'o. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with iguanas, but they get those spikes on top of their back. And that's exactly what these things look like. And it makes you scratch your head, but also you're in awe. And for me, it makes me retreat to the mo'olelo. So I dive into old Hawaiian language texts constantly, literally on an everyday basis, for all kinds of reasons. But I really dig into all of those things in order to understand context, in order to understand the history, in order to understand why, why these things are here. Who is the ali'i at the time? What was the mo'olelo that could be associated and comes into play? If you're going to rely on a translation of a mo'olelo, you're at a disadvantage because the mo'olelo can be read a number of different ways, and that's how the language comes into play. Directly and also indirectly topic is if we're talking about authenticity, it is both an onion that has different levels, if I can draw that analogy, that at a very broad level has some boundaries that we can agree upon. And then once you start getting in the inner layers, then it starts getting into territory we start to disagree. Authenticity is also a slippery slope. It's a moving target. It's difficult to identify even for the most Hawaiian of Hawaiians. And one more analogy is uala. People over in Ka'u prefer certain types of uala, and that's what they stick in the ground and grow. You go to Ni'ihau, it's different again. You go to Kauaʻi, it's different again. On the plains of Ewa in Oʻahu, the type of uala they're going to plant is going to be different. And so, it may still be uala, but it's going to be different types of uala. So we're not a homogeneous society, and even more so today in this modern context. For us, among the Ohana at Nu'alolo, we have created protocols that we gathered together under the noni trees there and looked at each other and said, how are we going to proceed? What's going to be our regular protocol? And we look at each other, and I'm happy to be part of this particular group because we have a certain look that we can look at each other in the eye and just kind of nod our head and agree. We understand because we live in the context. So that was a word on olelo and a word on authenticity. One last note I might say is, given this day and age where, as I said earlier, all my elderly contacts who are speakers of the language are now gone, in the vacuum, there is now a hybridization that is going on with the language. So even the name of this panel, Mākau Moʻomeheu, I happen to be a member of the lexicon committee in the 90s that decided on those words. I can tell you they're made up words. They're based on English. And culture is not new, but for some reason, people on the committee decided we need a new word. And I'm like, why? It's not a new thing. So they came up with this thing, Moʻomeheu, and it's one that I choose never to use because why? And then Mākau as well. Mākau as well was taken from Mākaukau. Mākaukau is a traditional word, not Mākau. So that's a representation of hybridization that again goes back to authenticity, which is a moving target, which is a slippery slope, and an onion and the uala. Mahalo.
Mahalo. Puakea, I know you got cut off quickly, but
Yeah.
Is there anything you wanted to add?
Well, I apologize for that, and it could well happen again. Just that notion of, authenticity is, I love, Keao, you're absolutely right, the slipperiest of slopes. One of my first jobs when I started at Kamehameha schools in the early 80s was to research the real name of Pu'owaina. Was it Pu'owaina? Was it Pu'owaina? Was it? I found 27 variations in Hawaiian sources. And many of them interpreted very clearly why it was Pu'owaina, Pu'owaina. There were all these different explanations verifying the authenticity of that. Mr. Kelsey worked with Henry K. Kahuna doing collection of place names, and he discussed the variations that occurred, and they were all authentic. So the accepting of multiple authenticity or contextual authenticity is sort of important as well. I share with Keao a mild resentment of making up words when I think the concepts are already perfectly extant. They're just shorter, or they're more utilitarian. And a story on that, if I could just take a moment. We were with Kamuela Kumukai in Oʻahu. An old gentleman, Ahia, flies in, and they hadn't seen each other in 50 years. Two old native speakers, they're talking with each other. And at some point, a team, Ahia had seen a group going down to Kauaʻi, and somebody else mentioned, oh, it was a hui pohili. And he didn't know the word, pohili, haka pohili. And when somebody, and I can't remember who in the group, had said, oh, it's short for kinipo pohili, he was livid. This was, again, an interactive tension with the university institution, saying, pokole, mamake oika pokole, oki ko wawai, mamake oika pokole. You like short, cut off your feet. And really, the way it was turned, the way it was phrased, is very much, if you like short, cut off your feet, not my feet. It was a very interesting kind of, so, but it's very much an authentic mark of our modern time and the need in the immersion classroom, et cetera, et cetera. So authenticity is contextual. That's really all I would be able to say. Is representing, knowing it is a big piece. Being able to represent it. We're not able to, there isn't a single true story. How can we present, this has a story. The Hi'iaka, we translated one of the Hi'iakas, and it was one of 12 different versions. Yeah, and it's our translation of that one of 12 versions. Variety abounds.
Mahalo. I apologize. I left for a quick minute because my tutu was knocking on my door, wondering what I was doing in my room for 3 hours. But I'm back now. Sabra, would you like to? Do you have anything to add for this question?
Well, these my cohorts have really added quite a bit here already. Every time, well, not recently, but every time I go to Honolulu, I really do try to get by Bishop Museum to see the latest exhibit, because I so appreciate them and have enjoyed them so very much. Our museum here on Kauaʻi, the Kauaʻi Museum, is still closed. But in thinking about, authenticity, and then hearing Keao's story about the uala. Keao, several years ago, gave me some uala that, Keao, where did it come from? Did it come from Ka'ula?
Ni'ihau, I think.
Ni'ihau? Yeah, but from Ka'ula before then.
Oh yeah, something like that.
A variety of uala that is yellow. It's extremely delicious. And with our most recent work trips here in July to Nualolokai, there were some concerns because the boats are not running on any regular kind of basis. So we did not have, for instance, every day we didn't have a boat dropping off ice or water or food. So we had to take in everything, or fish, or dig up the uala. And I was so happy to see that that Keao's team did make use of the uala that we had planted in there years ago. And then my team of the youth, we also dug up uala. And what I realized in doing that is, if I were going to feed 100 people, I would have to plant that whole hillside in uala. I would just have to have far more of it than we had. We got permission from state parks to fence a 1/6 of an acre. And the fence is high enough, 6 feet high, to keep the goats out. And within that, we partnered with the Botanical Garden, National Tropical Botanical Garden, and the archaeologists to identify the plants that we know used to grow there and that could still grow there. So, you know, Dr. David Burney and Mike D'Amata and all those guys at the Botanical Garden grew those plants for us. And then we got funding to bring them in, along with a water system, a big tank, because there is a freshwater lens there. And the Kupuna of old have dug down to it, and they lined that whole Oʻahu with smooth stones from the ocean, and it's beautiful. And the water is still there. We just have to keep the goats out of it. So I know with Keao's team, they actually filtered it, and I believe drank it. We did as well, and it is still possible to survive. We just have to be careful that, you know, we don't have leptospirosis or anything like that in it. But when you talk about authenticity and museums, and my whole thing is, you must feel it, you must experience it, you must see it. To me, it is not just reading about it. You must come and see yourself.
If I can add one fast note, I wanted to tip the hat also to Helen earlier, because she was talking about, and also Teresa talked about learning the mo'olelo, learn the story of the items that you're talking about. And what Auntie Sabra is talking about is you are living that story of the item when you are actually in the environment in which it came from. You know, and that's where it's not just it's not a label it's not a label at all that you place on it. It's the touching of it, it's the experience of it, it's the feeling of the breeze, standing in that spot where the item came from, looking at the pali over there and over there, what it's relative to, you know, spending the nights and the days in that spot and actually absorbing this experience of environment, of place. And when you couple that with the mele and the olelo, and Tiseba is really taken off with her experience with hula has blossomed because of her experience of putting her feet in the lepo of this spot. You know what I'm saying? So it becomes more than just an item, but an experience.
If I can just toss in, when Teresi was talking about, you know, bringing the community in, that was, it's almost the flip side of taking the folks from the institutions, get them, or get anyone out into the field, find it in situ and whatnot. But bringing the community in is also, it's enriching for those who are seeing, but it's also enriching for the institution to be able to, you know, sort of absorb the, it's not the breeze, but it's some of the passion is certainly catchy. So that interchange it diminishes the antagonism from both sides. Yeah. You know, that you know, the doers see the institution as sort of the, you know, gatekeepers, holders, but the keepers feel a long responsibility to, you know, shepherd it carefully. A point that was there, and I know many of the keepers of different institutions, and it's the local ones who have a personal investment with the collections. They feel a responsibility, are less likely to be drawn by the power of, you know, whether it's financial or professional or whatnot, to step away from things they've initiated. So the more you can get people engaged with the collections they're shepherding, I think the more long-term kuleana you're going to be able to foster on that side as well. I just wanted to toss that in. That's
Mahalo. Okay, so we have one more question left, and you have nicely transitioned us into this question, Puakea. And the question is, what kind of changes would you like to see in our local institutions? And what does Hawaii's heritage, from your perspective, what does Hawaii's heritage sector look like in the future? As they are answering, if you do have a question, again, please submit it through the chat option here. I think we'll have time for 1 or 2 questions at the end. So if you folks could have that up, we'll choose when that time comes. So let's start with Sabra.
Okay, what kind of change would we like to see in this? Well, first of all, I really feel that Hawaii, and sorry guys, but especially Kauaʻi, because of our very, very low rate of COVID, is in a sense a safe haven. And there's a lot of people in the world who are looking for a safe haven, a safe place. So I do anticipate that once the doors are opened again, we will have quite an influx of people. We just want to make sure that we are all safe and that we don't spread the disease here. I think Hawaii's heritage sector looks incredibly strong. I think we have a tremendous amount to share. I think we have things of great beauty in our collections. I think we have stories that are just fascinating. And I believe that there is a great hunger for that kind of knowledge, that kind of information, not just by those of us who live here, who are lucky to live here, but from people all around the world. We have someone who has come in from the Philippines, you know, and your reach with this museum association is worldwide. And the stories that you share, the experiences that you have, the collections that you have are of great importance. And I thank you all so much for caring for them.
Mahalo, Sabra. Keao, or I see Puakea gesturing towards. Okay. Oh, I see Keao pointing to Puakea.
Well, let me just dive in. Mostly the change I would like to see is a continuation of the change that I've seen unfolding for the last 20 or 30 years, and a much more sort of opening up of the museum as a interface. But that's a two-way piece as well. I mean, I'm really delighted with a bunch of the projects that have come, that I've been able to do with different, the letters collection that came out of the Mission Children's, you know, can be notoriously closed. And, you know, there's a resource that opened a window, not reading about Ka'ahumanu, but reading what Ka'ahumanu was saying. I mean, that's invaluable. So that kind of development of materials, but it's really difficult oftentimes. The institution doesn't have the luxury of initiating all of these. So a lot of this has to be in dialogue with the doers, like I say. But also, we as a community have to invest our support in these. These are the shepherds. These are the caretakers. The letter that I'm asking to see, somebody's taken care of it for 150 years. There's a cost with that. And I know that, you know, some of the archivists have said, you know, if everybody who came in here dropped $1 in a bucket, we wouldn't have to charge for copies. I mean, just that notion of generating enough of a good relationship with the community that we actually get. It's not the huge philanthropists that'll keep this alive. It's the nickel dimers like me, you know, that when I have $100, I throw it at the Museum Archives, or, you know, one of the collections, because I rely on them. But getting that mindset really widespread and seeing them as, what do you call it, as an alliance. So building, that's the change I'd like to see, is a continuation of building alliances and really mutual respect, resource, and the cost of bearing that. We can put hours in at Nu'alo'o or at Waiahole or wherever. I mean, that's an investment. Can we also invest in the other places where these things are being cared for, maintained? You know, there's different levels of investment to go with. So that would be my word.
Mahalo. Keao?
I would, first of all, I want to congratulate all the museums. They are fantastic places, and they are important. They are uh, they are one of those sources of wealth in our communities, because it doesn't matter what museum I go to, whether in Barcelona or Te Papa or in the Louvre, um, or the Met in New York or Bishop Museum, I get this sense of a combination of amazement, awe, and dread all at the same time. And uh, it's a very real contention inside my na'au. Walking through by the archive area, in the courtyard area at Bishop Museum, and there's that rock garden, you know, with all these different akua, poaku, and stuff. And that to me is, I have a sense of wow, and also a sense of ooh, you know what I mean? It's spooky, you know, because you got to think about what is the mo'olelo behind how that thing ended up right over here, you know. And there's mana inside that thing, and there's mana inside that other thing. Do these two mana actually jive? Do they belong together? You know, so I do that. I look at this item over here. Even in the Hawaii Hall, I go to the Tahitian section and I look at the items, over there, and I look at these items over here, and then there's this next item, and they're just put together right under the same display. But in my mind goes through all kinds of different directions. Wonderful, right? It's good that I'm experiencing this, is what I'm saying. But I wonder to myself, do these items belong together? Do they belong, should they be here? But I don't know their story, so maybe yes and maybe no. But that's the place, that's what museums are for. They're for us to have that moment, you know. And so I congratulate museums for being there. What do I see in the future? I see satellite branches or satellite displays more around the island. Satellite locations on campuses, at schools. Temporary, 6 months, whatever, traveling, uh, you know, anywhere. Malls, hospital, lobbies, hotels, I don't care. My house, uh, right on, build me one glass case, and take all precautions, but we shouldn't let fear stop us. We shouldn't say, oh, get insurance, get liability, right on. So therefore what? Do nothing? Find a way. Don't let fear stop you from putting the access out there, especially in COVID. Sheesh, we cannot go there. So take it out. Take out what can be taken out. Those things that cannot, oh well, we can understand. But whatever is feasible, maybe some kahili, maybe some, who knows, kapa, maybe some, who knows what. If they can be movable, let's think of how we can support Bishop Museum. I know it's come out of a rough time fiscally and all this, but I also understand it's headed in a good direction, which is hopeful, yeah. So for me, so you asked, if the question is, what do I see in the 21st century? I see satellite and more access to the communities who normally would not go over there.
Mahalo. So we have one question, and I think I'll ask this question and then we will end. But the question ties in really well with what you just said with regards to satellite institutions. And the question is from Bernadette. And she says, with the advent of digital media, so if we think about collections going online or all of this content being readily accessible, how do we ensure that local cultures and heritage are well represented and not just used for something else or used in an extractive way, perhaps? Is there a way that we can perhaps mitigate that or be at the forefront of addressing these issues?
Well, I think it's a matter of our telling our own stories, like Keao has been talking about. We need to tell our own stories. You know, whether it's in satellite displays or whether it's digitally online. Tell your own stories. Tell the stories of the place. Tell the stories of the people of that place. Tell the stories of the artifacts of that place. There's such a rich mo'olelo. The mo'olelo are rich in Hawaii, as Puakea well knows, and Keao as well.
Can I just toss into that, that a lot of that has to do with how things are curated, and that guidance coming in, becoming part of the institutional, to guide how these things are presented. Because really, everything that's in the museum has always stood the possibility of being used for a Coca-Cola ad or a, or anything, and they've been there. Digitizing it won't make that more dangerous, but contextualizing things and really generating an appreciation for sort of the bigger picture of it is always going to be powerful. So, I mean, to me, the whole digital technology is just, this is magic. I am from a time, I mimeographed my first assignments. All of my work with newspapers was done with papers and then microfilms, and then, so me being able to zap up whether it's a letter or a newspaper in a minute, and that possibility is wonderful. But we do have to kind of frame it. I think that we can do a lot of service to both the content and the audience by working on the way things are curated. So, putting Papa Kilo up, put 500,000 pages of material in the hands of people that still don't know what it is. So how are ways that can be presented that make it maybe a better package? How's that?
Keao?
Yeah, and tag off of that, I cannot, we say, mahalo anui pole na ole, I cannot tell you how much I mahalo Papa Kilo. It makes me feel smart. I feel smart to get Papa Kilo. I can lie to anybody and make as if I already knew it. And no, Papa Kilo, nupepa.org, everyone, whoever was involved in that, I owe you guys an eternal debt of gratitude for opening up scholarship. That was the door that just let the dam burst. Yeah, let the dam burst. And it's not full yet. It's not entirely archived yet. And so
no, it's barely begun, Keao. I mean, from the bigger view. But I'm sorry to intrude, but
mahalo.
It's such a breakthrough. You're right.
And you were an integral part of that. Very fundamental.
There's a whole team. There's a lot of hands on that button.
Yeah,
but it worked well.
I'm enjoying drowning. Me too.
Drowning. Me too.
Yeah.
I'm entertained every day.
I enjoy trying to fill my Dixie cup with the dam bursting in front of my face. I enjoy the coolness of the it's so awesome and such a relief. So I would say that there's no way you're going to be able to mitigate people's intentions. People will take information and run with it and do dirty things with it and do good things with it. And there's absolutely no way to know one from another. And locals are not exempt. Some of the biggest problems we have, Napali side Kauaʻi, is hello, we like to blame our tourists, but aole, you get some kolohe bagas in my neighborhood, and that's my own people, and they can be careless. So people can be careless with the kuleana they've been given, and there's no way to prevent that. So don't let that fear prevent you either from doing what you gotta do in your community. So yeah, I mean, I really don't have any more to add to what Puakea and Auntie Sabra just contributed.
I would just love to, since I have this little bit of time, to add to what you're saying about the value of Papa Kilo and these at least for us, these online databases, I'm just starting off on my PhD. Well, I'm midway through my PhD journey, but when I was a wee little undergrad at the University of Hawaii at Hilo, that's when I first encountered Hawaiian language newspapers. And that's when I first realized that I'm from Keaukaha in Hilo in Hawaii. It's the first place that I realized that we have a history that happens before the homestead, before Keaukaha becomes the next Hawaiian homestead. And when it was a project I started on Keaukaha School, but being able to find in the newspapers these stories by Kupuna about trying to get a school in the community and just building it up is something that made me realize that I could make a project out of this. I could make a dissertation out of this. And so that's where I'm today, is really trying to look at these other archival sources that we have that adds to our understanding of our individual communities. So I'm very thankful to be able to have benefited from these materials having gone online. So, and as Keao said, there are going to be those who may abuse these things, but at the same time, I think the benefits and the inspiration that it affords for the next generation outweighs some of those issues. And indeed, we have to address those, but that shouldn't deter one from doing the necessary work that needs to be done. So mahalo. Ya oko pakahia pau no ke ia kamailo ana. It was quite insightful, and it makes me very hopeful that we have a future here in Hawaii for our institutions, as well as our important special places throughout our islands. I do want to note, before you leave, for our participants, we would really appreciate if you'd fill out our evaluation form, because that's how grants work. So if you can take a little bit of time to fill out our form, I'm posting the link once more. You can find the form at our website at hawaiimuseums.org/Mākau. And just take a few minutes to let us know what you thought about this, how we can improve, and any other comments or questions that you might have that wasn't addressed here. So again, I'd like to thank our presenters one more time for the fantastic job they've done today. And I hope you all have a wonderful evening here in Hawaii, and a wonderful morning or afternoon wherever you are in the world. Aloha.
Mahalo nui, aloha kākou.